This is Duke University.
You guys want? Okay. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Phil Albart, the president of the Federalist Society this year. Welcome to Betting the Earth. We have Professor John Kunich joining us and Dr. Stuart Pym from the Environmental School. This is our first event of the year, so welcome. I hope you enjoy it. I'd also like to point out that our next event is a week from today at 5 p.m. That will be discussing the Libya intervention, so I welcome you all to come to that as well. Professor Kunich was a Fulbright Senior Specialist in Law serving at the Indian Law Institute in New Delhi, India, where he taught comparative environmental law to PhD and LLM students. He was born in Chicago and has a Bachelor of Science degree in Biological Science from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he has a Master's of Science degree in Entomology from the University of Illinois at Chicago in 1979.
Phil, we don't need to go through the whole list.
Of course, he has highest honors in everything. And if you don't know Dr. Pym, he's the Doris Duke Chair of Conservation Ecology at the Nicholas School of the Environment here at Duke University. Would you like me to say anything more about you?
It's okay.
All right. Perfect. Then I will turn it over to Professor Kunich.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. I thank Dr. Pym for agreeing to be on this panel with me. It's a real honor to share the podium with a world-class expert. And we have so little time to talk about perhaps the most momentous issues ever facing the planet. It's sort of ironic, actually, but we're going to solve all the world's problems in the next 45 minutes or so, I promise. And I guess my main thesis, I'll be upfront about this. Dr. Pym and I probably agree on almost everything when it comes to what to do about the environment. But what I want to talk about initially is where we've gone so wrong. We have world-class scientists like Dr. Pym who have told us what the evidence is, who have told us what's going on with the biggest environmental challenges we've ever faced as a species. Climate change, mass extinction, things of this nature, which arguably are more significant than anything else we've ever done or confronted as a species. And yet, if you look at the legal response all over the world, in the United States, internationally, it's so inadequate as to be appalling. It's almost as if none of this evidence existed. It's almost as if scientists like Dr. Pym had never written anything, had never spoken about these issues. And this bothers me, and I liken it in my latest instant non-bestseller, Betting the Earth, how we can still win the biggest gamble of all time. I liken it to a worldwide gambling problem. And I have a personal gambling problem. I go on tilt a lot. I make irrational, stupid decisions in poker, and that does harm to my own family, my immediate surroundings. But when we do that as a planet, it's a lot worse. You don't want to go on tilt when you're gambling with the planet's future. Why do we do this? Why do we make such poor decisions on the biggest issues we've ever faced? And I think a lot of it has to do with the nature of these problems. Climate change, mass extinction, to single out what I think are the two biggest examples, are problems of a type that we're singularly poorly disposed to handle as a species. These are long-term, relatively slow, gradually evolving problems. And the evidence of them is rather subtle. It's nuanced. It's capable of varying interpretations. And indeed, it's very easy to overlook entirely. If you're not looking for it, you probably won't see it. And because of that, our usual response is either to be entirely ignorant of it, or if we are aware of it, to consider it not to be any real big problem at all. There's always something more urgent, more important, more immediate that deserves our attention and the attention of Congress, the United Nations, etc. And so, what can we do about this? We evolved a long time ago to handle immediate, obvious threats. A lion jumping out of the bush at us. You don't have a lot of time to focus group that, to subject it to nuanced decision-making analysis. You either decide to do something or to give up in a split second. What do we do now when the threats facing us are so slow-moving and nuanced? Well, If you look at the history of environmental law in this country, many of our federal environmental statutes were passed in the immediate aftermath of some big controversy. 3 Mile Island, Love Canal, some air pollution episodes, etc. Something that energizes the general public, that puts an environmental issue in the headlines on the evening news, in the days when there was the evening news, and all of a sudden everyone starts to panic and they demand action from their legislators. And this in turn shocks Congress out of its usual stupor, and they pass a law, usually in haste, not usually a good law, but they pass something just to show that they can pass a law. And that's how we roll, basically. And if you look at our statutes, every one of them, almost without exception, came about as a result of such a controversy. There is no analog for climate change or mass extinction. People ask me, I've written several books about the current mass extinction, like Ark of the Broken Covenant, and people ask me, well, Kunich, you think you're so smart, you think we're in the midst of a 6th mass extinction right now. What does it look like? I said, well, look out the window, that's it. It looks perfectly normal. It's calamity masquerading as calm. You can't see the immediate, visceral, scary type of evidence that we're losing perhaps half of all life on Earth just by looking out the window. And so most of us assume that there's nothing wrong. In the election when George Bush I was up for re-election, the issue came down to the northern spotted owl and the old-growth forests in the Pacific Northwest, and he characterized it as a matter of jobs versus owls. Well, when you put the issue that way, guess which one wins when it's humans casting the vote? It's going to be jobs every time. And that's the way the climate change debate has developed. We are confronted with a false choice between doing something about anthropogenic, i.e. human-generated climate change, or having jobs, having a decent economy, pulling out of these multi-year doldrums that we're in. And when it's phrased that way, people will vote for the economy every time. It's the economy, stupid. It's always going to be the economy, stupid. We never vote for the environment unless and until it reaches the cataclysmic stage. For better or for worse, a lot of people get their idea of what climate change looks like from pop culture, from rather bad movies like The Day After Tomorrow. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I'll bet some of you have seen The Day After Tomorrow. That's what they think climate change looks like. When you can see the new ice age chasing you down the hall and you try to outrun it and slam the door to the library before it freeze dries you in your tracks. No, that's not how climate change happens. But it happens so gradually, so imperceptibly, over centuries even, that if you made a movie out of that, even Andy Warhol would find it too boring. It would go on for centuries, and you'd still wonder, well, is this genuine, or is this one of those periodic fluctuations like the mini ice age, the medieval warm period? Who knows? Stay tuned another 5 centuries, maybe you'll know more. We don't have that kind of time. Mass extinction too. The actual IUCN red list, or the list of species that are certified to have gone extinct during the last several centuries, only numbers about 1,100 species out of over 1.7 million that have been given a scientific name in the world. And you tell people, hey, you know what, dude, we're in the midst of our 6th mass extinction now. They say, well, show me the list. Here it is, 1,100 out of 1.7 million. They say, what, are you crazy? Oh. But the thing is that a lot of species are committed to extinction. They are the living dead. How's that for another happy little phrase you can throw out at the next party you go to? They're the living dead. They've already been depleted so much. They've lost so much of their habitat. Their numbers are so reduced that they'll never fully recover. And it's only a matter of time before they literally go extinct. But you tell that to people and they say, what, do you think the Siberian tiger is committed to extinction? I just saw one in the zoo yesterday. I can see him on Animal Planet any day. Well, yeah. They might limp along for the next several centuries, even millennia, but they are committed to extinction, and more are going that route every day. But this isn't something where you can have film at 11. It isn't something that you see the scare headlines on the Huffington Post or the Drudge Report. Oh, mass extinction! We're losing a species every 10 years. Oh, what? That must be a misprint. No. But people aren't ready to accept that kind of evidence. So what do we do about it? Well, in Betting the Earth, I look at some of the decision makers, some of the philosophers, some of the theorists who have wrestled with how we make decisions, even momentous life and death decisions, when there are big gaps in our knowledge. Information that we really think is important and relevant to making an appropriate decision, but we can't know it. There's no way we can eliminate that doubt. Blaise Pascal, in his famous Pascal's Wager, showed us that there is a way of dealing with momentous decisions when there are unsolvable gaps in your knowledge base. But there is a rational way of dealing with it. You take the unknowns, you figure out what they are, and you sort of figure out best case, worst case scenarios for each of those variables and try to assign some probabilities to them. What would happen if I go this way with my decision and the variable turns out to be A or B? What happens if I make the opposite choice and the variable turns out to be A or B? And you figure out the permutations and combinations, and that at least gives you some information to deal with as you make your decision largely in the fog. Kurt Gödel, the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, dealt with the incompleteness theorems, showing that there are always in any closed system some things that are true that nonetheless cannot be proved true just relying on the resources available within that system. In other words, some things you have to take on faith. You can't prove everything, but that is a very unsettling position to be in when you're dealing with hugely important, planet-changing decisions. And there's some things you can't prove. Chaos theory, Edward Lorenz, the butterfly effect, not the movie with Ashton, but you know. And what do? When you think you know enough to manipulate a situation, you make this change in your carbon footprint, you expect to see a certain outcome. But Edward Lorenz said, with any decision, there's always going to be some element of doubt as to what the outcome will be. And it's sometimes, in fact, maybe always unpredictable. You can never be sure what the result will be of any action. It may be much better or much worse than you ever conceived possible. And that's very unsettling to people who like to press a button and they know what's going to happen. Nothing happens when I press this. Maybe if I press it often enough, something will happen. You know, where you're pressing a button that says, end climate change, or save half of all species on Earth from going extinct. You'd like to be able to see an immediate feedback, but you can't. It may be decades, it may be centuries before you know the consequences. We are conditioned to expect immediate gratification from our decisions. Look how well we're doing, you know, creating jobs in this country, right? The last 2 administrations have struggled with this. We've done all sorts of things, and how is it working? Well, that's a much more human contained enterprise. Jobs are something that people make for other people, right? And still, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of variables, and we don't get that immediate gratification no matter what we do. It takes a real leap of faith to do the right thing for climate change and for biodiversity loss. But because of the nature of the problem and the way we view decisions, I have very little hope that we're going to make the right decisions on these. These are the biggest issues we've ever faced as a species, and we're either ignoring them entirely or relying on prejudice, name-calling, political dogma to resolve the matter rather than looking at true evidence like Dr. Pym has spent his life amassing and making rational decisions, putting limits on our uncertainty and doing what we can, relying on the best tools we have available to make sure that when we're betting the earth, we shove all our chips to the middle of the table with the best of it, not when the odds are drastically against the decision that we're making. So I'll stop there and turn the time over to Dr. Pym.
In January, on one of those days when, you know, the ice storm has cut off electricity and you are huddled probably in this auditorium because you haven't had a shower at home, you know, for several days. If you take one of my classes, I'll be teaching it remotely via video conference from my home in Key Largo, and I will probably turn the monitor around so you can see that it is, in January, just another perfect day in paradise. We in Florida have a senator and a governor who deny climate change. But if you want to know about climate change in Florida, the best source of information is that very industry that deals with risk, the insurance industry. And the insurance industry knows full well about climate change. And if you're lucky, you have property insurance, and most people don't. Because if you live anywhere near the ocean, and most people in Florida do, it's very hard to get property insurance anymore. And the rates go up and up and up. And I live in a home there during the spring when I'm doing my field work, which is built like a bomb shelter. It's got a cement roof, it's got cement walls, it's got cement inner walls, and it's protected by a hardwood hammock and all the rest of it. Still have trouble getting insurance. So the people who understand risk understand premiums and understand the necessity of recognizing global change. So the question is really, why is there a debate? And I think this follows from what John has said, that when things are gradual and perceptible only with difficulty, it's easy for the dark side to spin things. I don't know to what extent you study the one bit of law I know about, which is the Endangered Species Act. But one of the key Supreme Court decisions way back at the beginning involved the Tennessee Valley Authority challenging the decision on an obscure little fish called the snail darter. The Little Tennessee River was the only free-flowing river in the Appalachians at the time. Everything else had been dammed by TVA. Many people opposed that dam. It was great trout fishing, burials of Cherokee Indians, lots of other values, but none of those things had standing. So a group of people approached one of my colleagues when I was at the University of Tennessee to see if he could find an endangered fish. The rumor was that they paid him 2 6-packs of cheap beer. Knowing David, I think he probably sold out for 1 6-pack, and I know it was cheap beer because he never gave me a decent beer in all the many occasions I went to his house. And he and his graduate students went to the river and found the snail darter, and it became an endangered species. That snail darter held up in court, I think they probably held up a sardine, this little fish versus the massive economic progress embodied by the shiny building of the Tennessee Valley Authority in Knoxville, was the forerunner of jobs versus owls and all these other debates. But there had to be an economic analysis. And the economic analysis was what would happen if you built the Tellico Dam. And the economists, the first time round, bless their hearts, said, this dam has no economic value whatsoever. It's a massive amount of taxpayers' money that's going to be squandered. And TVA said, no, that is not the right answer. So they came back and said, there is going to be a city of 60,000 people that will grow up around this dam when you build it. Fast forward 30 years, the dam was built. There is no city of 60,000 people at Tellico Dam. fact is that those issues, which involved a very straightforward economic analysis that said this dam is a disaster, that ought to have said, you know, God bless environmentalists for saving the taxpayers' money. None of that gets into the media. The reality of the decisions on the spotted owls, another Supreme Court case, in this case I helped write the amicus curiae brief, Sweet Home for the Sweet Home chapter for a Greater Oregon. What a glorious name. I mean, you feel totally American when you read that. Yes, I'm an American. Don't let the accent fool you. I'm from North Carolina, right? Versus Babbitt. You know, we have to chop the forest down as long as we don't kill the owls. It's okay to chop the forest down. Well, you know, if you chop the forest down, you kill the owls, and the Supreme Court did the honourable thing and agreed. We were chopping forest down at a rate of, well, we chopped forest down at a rate that 95% of the old-growth forest had gone in about 50 years, and you do not need to be mathematically sophisticated to understand that if you chop 95% down in 50 years, the other 5% isn't going to last very long, right? So this was a matter really of whether the logging companies were going to hold out for another 5 years or get kicked out then, and give the people who had old-growth forest some sort of an alternative life other than chopping trees down. And in fact, that's happened, and you know, people love old-growth forests for good reason. They're beautiful. And an appropriate economic activity grew up in its place. Now, the reason I've gone into those two decisions is the economics was clear, the science was clear, but boy, can people spin a different story. Jobs versus owls, you know, it's like 1,000 points of light and read my lips, you know, it's part of the, you know, it's part of the body of literature. So I think the issues are, yes, we know how to handle the risks, as John has said, and in many cases, the insurance companies are doing it for us. But how do we handle the truth? How do we handle the truth when sophisticated people can mount campaigns that convince our political leadership that scientists like me are fudging all the facts so that I can create jobs for all those students at the Nicholas School? I wish I had that sort of, you know, those Machiavellian instincts, but, you know, I don't. Thank you.
Well, at this time, we'll open the floor to questions, unless you have anything else to add, Professor Kunitz.
Well, let's see what the students want to say, and then
All right. Questions?
I have one for Professor Kunitz. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the market-based approach. I know you had a kind of a brief overview, but
could you repeat the question since we are recording it?
I'll try.
Right.
Talk a little bit more about a market-based approach. Well, the decision matrix that I've come up with in the book, I've come up with two of them, one for climate change, one for mass extinction. This is basically a market-based approach in that it simulates the insurance model that Dr. Pym mentioned. The insurance companies have made some judgments about the risk inherent in building a home or having a home anywhere near the coast in Florida. We need to do something more along those lines as a nation and as a world to talk about what we should be doing on things like mass extinction and on climate change. Looking at what the risk is with the best available evidence that we have. How bad could it be, and what are the probabilities that that will happen within a reasonable period of time? What can be done to either prevent or restore the damage in the event that does happen, and how much would that cost? Those are the main decisions involved with insurance. And basically, a rational decision maker, I hate to say a rational utility maximizer, but that's what it amounts to, would look at those those parameters for things like climate change and come up with some reasoned decisions. But the fact is that the Kyoto Protocol, which is the only international agreement currently in effect that deals with climate change, to which, of course, we are not a signatory, the United States never signed or ratified, is due to expire at the end of 2012, and nothing is set to take its place. This is a major disaster internationally speaking, and it's testament to human folly worldwide, where we've been unable to come up with any solution to this slow-moving but potentially cataclysmic problem, even relying on the best available evidence. We seem to do a good job of ignoring it.
The implementation of climate solutions is not particularly expensive. About 1.5 billion tons of carbon. That's more than all the emissions of Europe. That's more than all the emissions of cars and trucks combined worldwide. Comes from tropical deforestation. Something like 100,000 square kilometers of tropical forests go up in smoke every year. What does it cost to stop that? On the order of a few $1 billion. And a bilateral agreement between Norway, who has given Brazil $1 billion to stop its deforestation, Brazil essentially has. What are we doing in the United States? We are struggling to get the US Congress to allocate $400 million for this program, which is a very, very small amount of money. In terms of cost effectiveness, taking care of this lowest hanging fruit is economically a no-brainer. It's simple. It's easy to implement. Other countries are doing it. Why are we not doing it? And the answer isn't economics. The answer isn't even a failure to understand risk. It's the fact that none of our political leaders dare get out in front of an issue that would involve giving, $400 million a year to a bunch of foreigners.
Let me just piggyback on that. That's an excellent example because it actually cuts across both the climate change and the mass extinction lines. When you cut down the forests and you burn them, of course, that adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in the combustion. It also removes a carbon sink that would ordinarily take a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That's no longer happening. And in a veritable trifecta of environmental disaster, it eliminates the only habitat for a lot of species that are endemic to those forests. Why do we refuse to do anything about it? Largely because we're too myopic to see what's in it for us. Does it directly create jobs if we were to give Brazil some money to curtail their deforestation? If you can't answer that in an obvious yes, a lot of people don't want to hear about it. They'd rather say, well, we've got more important, more immediate things to deal with. And we always will, frankly.
Before the next question, I'd like to welcome Professor Wiener up to the front. As you saw on our posters, he was scheduled to be our moderator. Unfortunately, a faculty meeting took him away for the first half, but he graciously came over right after the faculty meeting. So, Professor Wiener, I'll hand off the question and answer session to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Phil and Jessley and all of you for organizing this session, and to Stuart and John for speaking. And obviously, it's been my loss that I've missed the initial comments that you've made, but I had this conflict come up. So I don't know everything that you've commented on, but I thought maybe I would tell me if you've covered this already, but just push the conversation a little further by saying, first of all, there may be some broad areas of agreement that a risk analysis approach is a good way to analyze a problem like climate change, so that even if it's uncertain, it may be worthwhile to take significant steps of a kind of insurance or prevention, just as we do for all sorts of other kinds of uncertain risks, like whether your house will burn down. We buy insurance, we install smoke detectors, and we use better materials, or the way the United States invested massively in deterrence during the Cold War against an uncertain risk of nuclear attack. So there are many other examples as well, but I think I agree with the sentiment that often decision makers from the individual to the government level do a poor job of applying risk analysis to difficult problems, and they are often distracted or don't face sufficient incentives to make good decisions. So that said, I think it's interesting that the United States is not a party to the Kyoto Protocol, as you say, but that happened only 5 years, in 1997, only 5 years after the United States did negotiate, sign, and ratify the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And moreover, in 1997, when the Clinton-Gore administration negotiated and signed the Kyoto Protocol, it was a Democratic administration and Democratic control of at least one, maybe both houses of Congress. But the Clinton administration never submitted the Kyoto Protocol to the Senate for ratification. And the Senate voted 95-0 for a resolution saying that it would not ratify a treaty like the Kyoto Protocol. So even before George W. Bush withdrew the United States from the Kyoto Protocol in March 2001, there was a significant political obstacle, bipartisan, 95-0 political obstacle to something like the Kyoto Protocol. And why is that? And I think one key aspect, so I think the incentive-based structure of the Kyoto Protocol was not the problem. I think that's actually helpful and could have been even designed even better. But it was mainly, it's the non-inclusion, if I can use that term, of the major emerging developing country powers whose emissions were already seeming to grow significantly, but in the 10 years after 1997 grew even more dramatically than was predicted in 1997. But already in 1997, the Senate was saying we won't ratify a treaty that doesn't have meaningful participation by major developing countries. And that, I think, is the problem that needs to be addressed now, to find a way to design an international regime that is attractive, because countries don't have to sign treaties. So it has to be on terms that are attractive to China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa. And that's why the negotiations at Copenhagen and Cancun over the last 2-3 years, although very limited in some sense, were also very important because they began to bring those countries more into a direct negotiation with the United States and Europe and Japan and Australia, et cetera, Canada. So I just want to raise that kind of question, whether we think we can make progress in that direction.
Let me try first. You've identified, I think, the key problem internationally. Because people view climate change regulation as an economic negative, it's a global game of chicken. No one wants to be the first one to commit. No one wants to say, all right, we'll commit to X% reduction in our carbon emissions over the next few years, but People's Republic of China, India, Brazil, you go right ahead. You don't have to commit. They don't want to do that because they realize that it would be political suicide at home to say, well, we've agreed to this economically harmful restriction on our industry, and we haven't demanded a quid pro quo from our major competitors. I think the only way out of this box, given human nature, and I'm something of a cynic, is that we have to break out of the paradigm by finding a way of doing well by doing good. We have to find a way that reducing our carbon emissions, doing something positive about climate change will actually be a net economic advantage for us. We can
domestically, even if whatever
yes,
the other countries are
whatever doing. That's a good idea because we'll make money, and if it helps the environment, so much the better. But we can sell it as primarily something that we will do because it's smart for us on the bottom line level. If we can come up with that kind of technological breakthrough, there will be no problem. People won't care that they're doing something to help the planet. They'll care that they're doing something to make more money. We're not there yet, but I think given human nature, there's very little hope that we're going to reach the kind of consensus we need on climate change without that. Nations there's nothing to replace Kyoto right now, and we're within a year and a half of its expiration. That's very bad news. We have to break out of this box where the only fix is really something that's going to cost us money. We have to find a way of making money while simultaneously reducing our emissions of carbon products.
I think we should have more questions.
Well, we talked a lot about politics, and obviously it's a little frustrating right now, but so in a non-political world, what do you guys see would be the ideal solution? I mean, barring a large international agreement, with the current technology we have, if we could just implement anything we wanted on in the United States, what would that solution look like?
Dr. Pym, do you want to try?
I thought it was interesting that you used the word technology, because a lot of people are running around in very excited ways talking about carbon storage and all these other sort of high-tech solutions. And their price of carbon, is about $100 a ton. I run a small non-profit, which I'm naturally going to give you the name of so that you will offset your carbon sin there. It's Saving Species, all one word, www.savingspecies.org. And our technological fix is a tree, which have been around a while. And we plant trees. And we offset your carbon for about $5 a ton, which means for about $70 a year. You could be so gorgeously carbon neutral that your halo shines in the dark. It is interesting how, I'm not trying to beat up on you on that word, but it's interesting because what you're really saying is, we want to do this technologically, which means we want to do it. Whereas if we do it cheaply, it's done somewhere else. And that comes back exactly to this point. We've got to make this, do we want it done cheaply or do we want to do it ourselves? How are we going to convince, our local politicians that it's in their economic interest to do that? That, I think, is the trick. We know how to offset 20% of global carbon emissions cheaply. Unfortunately, it won't happen in Iowa.
Let me piggyback on that just a bit and to say, when we're talking about energy production, we're sort of taking for granted that we are going to continue, if not expand, our current consumption of energy. We like the modern lifestyle with cars and planes and all sorts of things that are energy intensive, and we have no intention of cutting back to an Amish-like existence. Given that paradigm, though, there is no energy production technology or system or means of production that is entirely green. Let's just face it. Everything has its downside as well as its upside, including solar, wind, nuclear, etc., biofuels. And so we need to acknowledge the realities of each form of energy production and be prepared to deal with those realistically. None of these is going to be a panacea. Each one has to be dealt with in realistic terms. And when the government, here's that free market thing again, when the government subsidizes some forms of energy production over others, it tends to unlevel the playing field and skew the analysis, perhaps appropriately, perhaps inappropriately, in favor of certain means of energy production that may actually not be that good for the environment. The government's notoriously bad at making the optimal environmental decisions. Let's keep that in mind. And so when they favor things like biofuels, I always wonder, what makes them think that this is a good solution to the problem? I would prefer to see, again, the doing well by doing good syndrome, where people will try to figure out what's the new energy breakthrough that's going to be as favorable to the environment as possible, that will allow us to make more money, improve the quality of life all over the world, including countries that can't even approach our level of life expectancy and standard of living now. Help them, and at the same time come up with a better way of producing energy. I think that human interest, that self-interest, can actually wind up helping the environment more than any government edict.
The salient thing you need to know about energy subsidies is that we did not invade Iraq because its principal export was broccoli. That if you look at, a very significant fraction, half of where our tax dollars go, it goes to our military. And we are spending trillions of dollars to secure our oil supply. So if those subsidies were incorporated into the price at the pump, then gasoline would be very, very much more expensive. And other forms of energy would be, very, very attractive indeed. Now, do I think that's going to happen? No. But on the other hand, it also needs to cover the discussion because it does, when people say, well, why should we pay subsidies for wind or solar? The reality is we're investing trillions of dollars of subsidies to guarantee, our oil supplies coming out of the Persian Gulf.
I'll just add that my answer to your question is kind of the standard law professor's meta answer, which is to say that rather than pick a technology scenario, that what we ought to do is have a system of incentives that encourages a diversity of approaches and that stimulates and harnesses the power of ingenuity and innovation to develop a whole variety of different approaches, some of which we can't foresee right now. I would say, though, that although the doing well by doing good can be very helpful, that I think for a problem in which there's a global externality, that's not going to be sufficient. And so we need some policy changes in order to generate the kinds of incentives that would internalize the externality, that would get decision makers to face the full social cost or closer to the full social cost of their behavior and thereby start to feel the incentive to explore alternative energy, invest in stewards and other forest conservation or offset programs, and a variety of others. There were some other hands up here. Yeah.
I understand the attractiveness of the idea of doing well by doing good. Depending on some possible future technological breakthrough or other innovation, it's uncertain. Are there things we could be doing to first encourage the development of such a breakthrough, and in the meantime, before it gets here, what are our realistic options?
I think one of the best things we could do in this nation, both to incentivize research and also to make the most of the technologies that we already have, is to create a national power grid. Unlike, say, Canada and many other nations, we don't have a way of efficiently transferring electricity from one part of this nation to another. It would be a massive infrastructure initiative along the lines of the interstate highway system, but we really need a national power grid. We need to be able to transfer energy from the parts of the nation where, say, wind or solar are economically feasible to the parts where it is, where those are not feasible. We can't do that now, and so a lot of these solutions are very regional in their scope. We also lack a very good way of storing power. If we could solve those technological problems, it would go a long way to ameliorating the underlying difficulties we face. The only other thing I would say is that in addition to the power grid, if we would simply make more of an even-handed approach to subsidies, like the professor said, that to incentivize a diversity of approaches rather than selecting one or two favored industries, that would make it more feasible for researchers to take the evidence wherever they think is most favorable rather than focusing on the energy production technologies that are going to attract the grant money. We need to make it more friendly to whatever the evidence suggests rather than what Congress thinks is the favored method of the next few years.
Yeah, one more hand. Can we take one more?
Absolutely.
There was someone else who had a hand up. Katie.
I was just wondering what each of you thought was kind of the most achievable goal with the biggest impact given the current political climate.
think, if the Norwegians can come up with the equivalent of, 100 times per person what we are failing to do, that we can do a bit better. So this program is internationally called RED, Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. In the United States Congress, it's called Sustainable Landscapes. I think sustainable landscapes is eminently doable politically even in this climate, which will take care of 15% or 20% of global carbon emissions. And then I think the real dialogue has to be to shift the massive subsidies for fossil fuels, to something that's going to give us, as a nation, a longer-term sustainable supply of energy. And I think the technologies are there and growing, and they do not need to be hammered down by our obsession with fossil fuel.
So I want to let you have the last word. So I'll just add my brief comment, which is to very much agree with what Stuart just said. And we had an initiative I worked with Bill Riley in 1992-93 on something called the Forests for the Future Initiative, which was very much like the kind of thing that was just described. I think the rise of RED, the return of RED, is very important and very doable. I would add one other, which is US EPA has already promulgated something called the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Rule. And the reporting requirements are about to kick in, which means that all large emitters of greenhouse gases in the United States are going to have to report on their emissions. And just that information may be very potent in mobilizing responses, and the companies may take actions to reduce their emissions as historically under other information-based approaches like the toxics release inventory they did. But now
we're almost out of time. Since we're in a room filled with the leaders of the future at a great law school like this, I'm going to ask for a paradigm shift. I want each of you to think at least part of every day about what you care about the future, say 100 years into the future, 300, 500 years. Do you care at all what the world will be like 500 years from now, or do you not? I've been appalled at many institutions where people literally couldn't care less whether there are people or life on Earth 500 years in the future because they and everyone they know will be long dead. I hope that that's not the way you feel, and I would ask you to think about that. And if you do care at all, what can you do now that will in some way make that future a better one? Is there anything you can do, even if it's not going to have any immediate impact, even if you'll never live to see the fruits of it? Is there something you can do that might influence the future generations down the road in a positive way? If you can have that kind of paradigm shift, I think a lot of these other problems take care of themselves.
All right, thank you. Join me in thanking each of our participants.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.